After graduating from Amherst in 1926, Drew faced a difficult decision. He had been accepted to medical school but lacked the funds to attend. For 2 years, he worked as a biology teacher and coach at Morgan College, a historically black institution in Baltimore, saving money for his medical education. In 1928, he entered McGill University Faculty of Medicine in Montreal, Canada, as one of only a handful of African American students. At McGill, Drew thrived academically, distinguishing himself in the study of medicine and winning the prestigious Williams Prize for highest standing in his class. It was during this time that he first became interested in blood transfusions and preservation, a field that would become his life's work. The amber-colored fluid filled the glass container, catching the light in a London laboratory. It was 1940, and bombs were falling over Britain as the Blitz raged. In that moment, this golden plasma represented more than a scientific breakthrough. It was hope. Dr. Charles Drew stood watching, his reflection visible in the glass, a distinguished African-American surgeon in a world that would soon both celebrate his genius and reject his humanity. This liquid, which could save countless lives, would soon become a symbol of America's greatest contradiction, a nation fighting for freedom abroad while denying it to some of its own citizens at home. The story of Charles Drew and the blood bank is not merely a medical history. It is a profound human tragedy about the color of courage and the price of progress. New York City, 1940. The Columbia University Presbyterian Hospital laboratory buzzed with urgency. Charles Drew moved with purpose among his colleagues, his dark skin contrasting with the white coats they all wore. At 36, Drew had already distinguished himself as a brilliant researcher, but now he faced a monumental task. The war in Europe had created unprecedented demand for blood plasma, and the American government had turned to him for help. Drew carefully adjusted the centrifuge, watching as blood separated into its components. The red cells settled at the bottom, while the yellowish plasma rose to the top. This simple observation would revolutionize medicine and save millions of lives, yet it would also expose the irrationality of racial prejudice in its most visceral form. The telephone rang, piercing the concentration of the laboratory. It was a call from Washington, D.C., with an offer that would change Drew's life and the history of medicine. The British government, facing devastating casualties in the war, had requested help from America in establishing a blood collection and processing system. Drew's research on plasma preservation had made him the leading expert in the field. As he listened to the proposal, Drew understood the magnitude of what was being asked. He would need to develop a system to collect, process, and transport blood plasma across the Atlantic Ocean, a logistical and medical challenge unlike any before. Yet he could not have predicted that his greatest struggle would not be scientific but social, not against the limitations of medicine, but against the persistence of racism. London, England, 1941. The first shipments of plasma arrived under cover of darkness, transported by ships that dodged German U-boats. In underground hospitals, doctors marveled at this liquid gold that could be stored longer than whole blood and given to patients regardless of blood type. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Mortality rates from shock and hemorrhage plummeted. Soldiers who would have certainly died now survived. Back in America, newspapers celebrated the success of Blood for Britain, and Charles Drew became a medical hero. Yet even as his work saved lives across the Atlantic, the seeds of a painful contradiction were being planted in his homeland. The same system that had proven blood was universal, when separated into plasma, was about to be segregated by race in America, a decision that would force Drew to confront the unbearable irony of his position as a black man saving lives in a country that considered his blood inferior. The architect of life. The Columbia University Laboratory in early 1940 was a symphony of scientific precision. Glass containers clinked softly, centrifuges hummed at a steady rhythm, and the sharp scent of antiseptic hung in the air. Dr. Charles Drew moved through this controlled environment with the quiet confidence of a man who had found his calling. At 36, his tall frame and dignified bearing commanded respect, even in an era when such respect was not automatically granted to a man of his color. His hands, steady and precise, manipulated the instruments with the familiarity of an artist with his brushes. These hands would soon orchestrate a medical revolution that would save countless lives, yet would also become a focal point for one of the most glaring contradictions in American history. Charles Richard Drew was born on June 3, 1904 in Washington, D.C., the eldest of 5 children. His father, Richard, was a carpet layer, and his mother, Nora, was a trained teacher, though she was not allowed to teach in the segregated schools of Washington. From an early age, Drew exhibited an extraordinary intelligence and an unwavering determination. As a teenager, he excelled in athletics and academics, earning a scholarship to Amherst College in Massachusetts. At Amherst, he became a star football player, known for his speed and agility on the field, while also maintaining an impressive academic record. His athletic prowess earned him the nickname Mr. Everything among his classmates, but it was his scientific curiosity that would define his legacy. The golden liquid that divided a nation. Upon graduating from McGill in 1933, Drew interned at Montreal General Hospital before returning to the United States to begin his residency at Freedmen's Hospital in Washington, D.C. The contrast between his experiences in Canada and back home was stark. In Montreal, he had been judged primarily on his abilities as a medical student and future doctor. In Washington, he confronted the daily realities of American segregation, where his expertise was often questioned simply because of the color of his skin. Yet Drew refused to be deterred. He saw medicine as a universal language that transcended racial barriers, and he was determined to excel in a field that offered the potential to save lives regardless of race or social status. In 1938, Drew received a Rockefeller Foundation Fellowship to study at Columbia University, where he would earn his Doctor of Science in Surgery degree. Under the mentorship of Dr. John Scudder, Drew embarked on groundbreaking research into the preservation and storage of blood plasma. At the time, blood transfusions were limited by the fact that whole blood could only be stored for about 7 days before it began to deteriorate. Drew's research focused on separating plasma from the red blood cells, which could then be dried and reconstituted with water when needed. This process extended the shelf life of plasma significantly, making it possible to transport and store blood products for much longer periods. The implications for battlefield medicine were enormous. The laboratory at Columbia became Drew's sanctuary, a place where his scientific genius could flourish without the constraints of racial prejudice. He worked tirelessly, often late into the night, refining his techniques for plasma preservation. His meticulous approach to research and his innovative methodologies soon began to yield remarkable results. By 1940, Drew had developed a method for processing and preserving blood plasma that would revolutionize transfusion medicine. His process involved separating plasma from whole blood, freezing it, and then drying it to create a powder that could be stored for extended periods and reconstituted with sterile water when needed. This breakthrough would prove invaluable in the coming war, as it allowed for the creation of blood banks that could supply plasma to wounded soldiers far from traditional medical facilities. As Drew's research gained attention, so too did his reputation as a brilliant scientist. In 1940, he was asked to lead the Blood for Britain project, an initiative to collect and process blood plasma for British soldiers wounded in World War II. The project was a collaboration between the American Red Cross and British medical authorities, and Drew was the natural choice to direct it. His expertise in plasma preservation, combined with his organizational skills and leadership abilities, made him uniquely qualified for this critical role. Under his direction, the project would collect thousands of units of blood, process them into plasma, and ship them to Britain where they would be used to treat wounded soldiers. The success of this project would not only save countless lives, but also establish the foundation for modern blood banking systems. The Blood for Britain project began in August 1940, just months after the fall of France and during the darkest days of the Battle of Britain. German bombs were falling on London and other British cities, causing massive casualties among both military personnel and civilians. The need for blood plasma was urgent, and Drew and his team worked feverishly to meet this demand. They set up collection centers in New York City, where volunteers lined up to donate blood. Drew implemented rigorous standards for donor screening and blood processing, ensuring that the plasma collected was safe and effective. His innovative techniques for preserving and transporting plasma allowed it to be shipped across the Atlantic without spoiling, a remarkable logistical achievement given the technology of the time. The first shipments of plasma arrived in Britain in September 1940, and the impact was immediate. Doctors marveled at this liquid gold that could be stored for long periods and administered to patients regardless of blood type. The plasma was used to treat soldiers suffering from shock and hemorrhage, conditions that had previously been major causes of death on the battlefield. Mortality rates began to drop significantly, and British medical authorities credited the American plasma with saving countless lives. Newspapers in both Britain and the United States celebrated the success of the project, and Charles Drew became something of a medical hero. Yet even as his work was being hailed as a life-saving breakthrough, Drew was aware of the troubling irony that lay ahead. The same system that had proven blood was universal when separated into plasma was about to be segregated by race in America. By early 1941, the success of the Blood for Britain project had led to the establishment of the American Red Cross Blood Bank, with Drew appointed as its first director. He was tasked with creating a national system for blood collection and processing that could meet the needs of both the military and civilian populations. Drew threw himself into this work with characteristic energy and dedication, establishing standards and protocols that would form the basis of modern blood banking. He traveled across the country, setting up collection centers and training personnel in his techniques for plasma preservation. Under his leadership, the American Red Cross Blood Bank became a model of efficiency and scientific excellence, capable of processing thousands of units of blood each month. Yet even as Drew built this life-saving system, he was forced to confront the deeply entrenched racism of American society. In the spring of 1941, as the United States prepared for possible entry into World War II, the U.S. War Department issued directives regarding the collection and use of blood for military purposes. Despite the scientific evidence that plasma was universal and could be safely transfused between individuals of different races, the War Department insisted on maintaining a policy of racial segregation in blood collection. Plasma from black donors was to be labeled, colored, and stored separately from plasma from white donors, which was labeled white. This policy had no scientific basis whatsoever. Plasma is plasma, regardless of the race of the donor, but it reflected the pervasive racism of the time. For Charles Drew, this policy was both scientifically indefensible and personally insulting. He had devoted his life to medical science, to saving lives regardless of race or social status. Now, his own work was being used to perpetuate the very racial divisions he had sought to overcome through science. The amber-colored plasma that filled the glass containers in his laboratory, which should have been a symbol of unity and universal humanity, was instead being used to reinforce segregation and inequality. Drew was caught in an impossible position. The system he had created was saving lives, but it was also perpetuating a lie about the fundamental nature of human blood. The man who had pioneered the techniques that made modern blood banking possible was now being forced to implement a policy that flew in the face of everything he knew to be scientifically true. The tension between Drew's scientific knowledge and the racist policies of the U.S. military came to a head in the spring of 1941. As director of the American Red Cross Blood Bank, Drew was expected to oversee the implementation of the segregation policy. Yet he could not in good conscience participate in a practice that was not only scientifically baseless, but also morally repugnant. In April 1941, after months of internal conflict and fruitless attempts to change the policy, Drew made the difficult decision to resign from his position. In his letter of resignation, he wrote that the policy was a humiliation to the American people, and that he could not continue to be associated with an organization that would implement such a practice. It was a courageous stand, but one that came at great personal cost. Drew was giving up the opportunity to lead the very blood bank he had helped create, all because he refused to compromise his principles. The resignation of Charles Drew from the American Red Cross Blood Bank was a pivotal moment in both medical history and the history of the civil rights movement. It exposed the deep-seated racism that persisted even in scientific and medical institutions, and it highlighted the courage required to stand up against injustice. Drew's actions were widely reported in the black press, which praised him for taking a stand against segregation. Yet in the broader American society, his resignation received little attention, and the racist policies of the blood bank continued unchanged. The man who had pioneered the techniques that would save countless lives during World War II was now largely excluded from the system he had created, forced to watch from the sidelines as his work was used to perpetuate the very divisions he had sought to overcome. After his resignation, Drew returned to Howard University in Washington, D.C., where he had been a professor of surgery before taking the position with the American Red Cross. At Howard, he continued his work in medicine, training a new generation of black doctors and surgeons. He also became an increasingly vocal advocate for the elimination of racial barriers in medicine and society at large. In speeches and articles, Drew argued that racism had no place in scientific or medical practice, and that the segregation of blood was not only scientifically baseless, but also morally indefensible. His words carried weight because of his stature as a leading medical scientist, and he used that influence to challenge the racist policies that continued to plague American society. The amber plasma that Charles Drew had pioneered continued to save lives throughout World War II, flowing into the veins of wounded soldiers regardless of their race. Yet the system that distributed this life-saving fluid remained segregated, a stark reminder of the contradictions at the heart of American society. The man who had unlocked the secret of preserving plasma, who had proven that blood was universal in its life-giving properties, was forced to watch as his discovery was used to reinforce racial divisions. It was a bitter irony that would define Drew's legacy, a legacy of scientific brilliance in the face of social injustice, of life-saving innovation in the midst of persistent racism. The golden liquid that had the power to unite humanity in its shared need for life was instead being used to divide, a contradiction that would haunt Charles Drew for the rest of his days. The color of courage. The Howard University College of Medicine stood as a beacon of excellence in a segregated America. Its halls echoed with the footsteps of pioneers, men and women who had overcome immense obstacles to pursue their calling in medicine. For Charles Drew, returning to Howard in the spring of 1940, one was both a homecoming and a new beginning. The laboratories and classrooms here were familiar, yet Drew himself had changed. The man who walked these halls now carried the weight of a profound moral struggle, a battle between scientific truth and societal prejudice that had forced him to relinquish leadership of the very blood bank he had created. The amber plasma that had once been his pride now symbolized the bitter paradox of his existence, a life-saving innovation tainted by the color line. Howard University had been founded in 1867, just 2 years after the end of the Civil War, as an institution of higher learning for newly emancipated African Americans. By the time Drew returned in 1941, it had established itself as one of the nation's premier black universities, its medical school producing some of the most distinguished African American physicians in the country. The campus buzzed with intellectual energy, a stark contrast to the rigid segregation that defined Washington, D.C. and much of American society. Here, Drew could focus on what mattered most: training the next generation of black doctors and advancing medical science without the compromises that had been demanded of him at the Red Cross. In his office at Howard, Drew surrounded himself with medical journals, research papers, and photographs of his family. The space reflected both his professional dedication and his personal commitments. On his desk sat a small glass vial containing amber-colored plasma, a constant reminder of the work that had defined his career and the moral struggle that had reshaped it. When students and colleagues entered his office, they were struck by Drew's presence, a tall, dignified man whose eyes conveyed both intelligence and intensity. His voice, calm yet authoritative, commanded attention as he discussed surgical techniques, research methodologies, or the challenges facing African Americans in the medical profession. Drew's return to Howard allowed him to refocus on his research and teaching, but it did not mean he had abandoned the fight against racial segregation in blood banking. In fact, his position at Howard gave him a platform from which to continue challenging the racist policies of the U.S. military and the American Red Cross. In lectures and public appearances, Drew spoke with scientific authority about the absurdity of segregating blood by race. He explained in clear, accessible terms how plasma was plasma, regardless of the race of the donor, and how the practice of labeling plasma white or colored had no basis in scientific fact whatsoever. His arguments were compelling not only because they were scientifically sound, but also because they came from a man who had literally written the book on blood preservation. The scientific facts were unequivocal. Human blood is composed of several components, the most abundant being red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and plasma. Plasma, the yellowish fluid in which blood cells are suspended, makes up about 55% of blood volume and contains water, proteins, salts, and other substances. When blood is centrifuged, the heavier red blood cells settle to the bottom, leaving the plasma as a supernatant that can be collected and processed separately. One of the most important characteristics of plasma is that it lacks the antigens that determine blood type, making it universally transfusible to patients of any blood type. This was the scientific breakthrough that Drew had pioneered, the ability to separate, preserve, and store plasma for later use in transfusions. The racial segregation of blood was based on a complete misunderstanding of these scientific facts. Those who advocated for segregation claimed that there were biological differences between the blood of white and black people that made transfusion between races dangerous. This claim had no scientific basis whatsoever. Blood type is determined by the presence or absence of certain antigens on the surface of red blood cells, not by race. The ABO blood group system and the Rh factor are the most important determinants of blood compatibility, and these factors are distributed across all racial groups without regard to race. A white person with type O negative blood can safely donate to a black person with type O negative blood, and vice versa. The same is true for plasma, which lacks these antigens altogether. Drew's frustration with the segregation policy was compounded by the fact that it was being implemented during a time of national crisis. World War II was raging, and the need for blood plasma was greater than ever. By segregating the blood supply, the U.S. military was creating logistical challenges that could have been avoided. Separate collection centers, separate storage facilities, and separate distribution systems all added unnecessary complexity to a process that needed to be as efficient as possible. More importantly, the segregation policy undermined the very purpose of the blood bank, to save lives. When plasma was in short supply, medical personnel were prohibited from using colored plasma for white patients, even though it was medically identical to white plasma. This meant that lives were potentially being lost due to a policy based on racial prejudice rather than scientific fact. The hypocrisy of this situation was not lost on Drew. The United States was fighting a war against Nazi Germany, a regime that had elevated racial prejudice to state policy. Yet here at home, the U.S. military was implementing policies that were disturbingly similar in their racial assumptions. Americans were being asked to sacrifice their lives for freedom and democracy abroad, while being denied basic rights and dignity at home. For Drew, this contradiction was deeply personal. He had dedicated his life to saving lives through medical science, Yet he was being told that his contributions were somehow less valuable because of his race. The amber plasma that flowed from his research had the power to save soldiers of all races, yet the system that distributed this plasma was determined to reinforce racial divisions. In the operating rooms at Howard Friedman's Hospital, Drew continued to perform surgeries and teach surgical techniques to medical students and residents. His hands moved with precision and confidence as he demonstrated procedures ranging from appendectomies to more complex operations. Students watched in awe as Drew worked, his calm demeanor and technical mastery setting an example for all who observed him. In these moments, the racial barriers that existed outside the hospital walls seemed to fade away, replaced by the universal language of medicine and the shared goal of healing. Yet even here, Drew could not escape the realities of segregation. Friedman's Hospital served primarily black patients, and while the care provided was excellent, the very existence of a separate hospital for African Americans was a reminder of the segregated world in which they lived. The contrast between Drew's professional accomplishments and his status as a black man in America was stark. On one hand, he was a renowned scientist and surgeon, whose innovations in blood preservation were saving lives around the world. On the other hand, he was subject to the same racial discrimination as other African Americans, denied basic rights and dignity because of the color of his skin. This contradiction was perhaps most evident in the fact that Drew himself, despite his expertise and the life-saving nature of his work, would have been prohibited from donating blood to the very blood bank he had created, at least not for white patients. The irony was almost unbearable. The man who had unlocked the secret of preserving plasma was considered unfit to contribute to the blood supply because of his race. Throughout 1941 and 1942, Drew continued to speak out against the segregation of blood, though his efforts had little immediate effect. The U.S. military and the American Red Cross remained committed to their racist policies, despite the lack of scientific justification. Yet Drew's words did not fall on deaf ears. Within the African American community, his stand against segregation was widely praised and helped to galvanize opposition to the blood bank's policies. Black newspapers across the country covered Drew's resignation and his subsequent criticism of the Red Cross, framing his actions as a courageous stand against racial injustice. For many African Americans, Charles Drew became a symbol of resistance, a man who refused to compromise his principles even when it meant giving up a position of prominence and influence. The impact of Drew's stance extended beyond the African American community. Some white physicians and scientists also spoke out against the segregation of blood, though their voices were often drowned out by the prevailing racism of the time. In medical journals and at professional conferences, a small but growing number of medical professionals questioned the scientific basis for segregating blood and pointed out the potential harm caused by this policy. These arguments were bolstered by Drew's impeccable scientific credentials and his status as an expert in blood preservation. Yet despite these challenges, the U.S. military and the Red Cross remained steadfast in their commitment to segregation, reflecting the deeply entrenched nature of racial prejudice in American society. As the United States entered World War II following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the demand for blood plasma skyrocketed. The American Red Cross launched massive blood drives across the country, urging Americans to donate blood for the war effort. Posters and advertisements depicted blood donation as a patriotic duty, a way for civilians to contribute to the fight against fascism. Yet these appeals for unity and sacrifice were undermined by the segregation of the blood supply. African Americans were encouraged to donate blood, but their contributions were labeled, colored, and set aside for use only by black soldiers and civilians. This policy sent a clear message. While all Americans were expected to sacrifice for the war effort, not all Americans would be treated equally. For Charles Drew, watching this unfold was deeply painful. He had devoted his life to medical science, to finding ways to save lives regardless of race or social status. Now, His work was being used to perpetuate the very racial divisions he had sought to overcome through science. The amber plasma that filled the glass containers in laboratories across the country, which should have been a symbol of unity and shared humanity, was instead being used to reinforce segregation and inequality. Drew was forced to confront a difficult truth. Scientific progress alone could not overcome the deeply ingrained prejudices of society. Even in the face of overwhelming scientific evidence, racism persisted, distorting and corrupting the life-saving potential of medical innovation. In the operating rooms and classrooms of Howard University, Drew continued his work, training a new generation of black doctors and surgeons. He instilled in his students not only the technical skills necessary for excellence in medicine, but also a commitment to challenging the racial barriers that limited their opportunities. His students admired him not only for his medical expertise, but also for his moral courage, his willingness to stand up for what was right even when it came at great personal cost. For these young doctors, Charles Drew was more than a teacher. He was a role model, a living example of how to maintain one's dignity and integrity in the face of systemic racism. The war continued to rage, and the blood plasma that Drew had pioneered continued to save lives on battlefields around the world. Yet the system that distributed this life-saving fluid remained segregated, a stark reminder of the contradictions at the heart of American society. The man who had unlocked the secret of preserving plasma was now largely excluded from the system he had created, forced to watch from the sidelines as his work was used to perpetuate racial divisions. It was a bitter irony that defined Drew's legacy, a legacy of scientific brilliance in the face of social injustice, of life-saving innovation in the midst of persistent racism. The amber plasma that flowed from his research had the power to unite humanity in its shared need for life, yet it was being used to divide, a contradiction that would haunt Charles Drew for the rest of his days. The bitter harvest. The winter of 1943 settled over Washington, D.C. like a shroud, blanketing the city in cold and snow. Inside the Howard University College of Medicine, however, the atmosphere was warm with intellectual fervor. In his laboratory, Dr. Charles Drew hunched over a microscope, his eyes focused on a slide containing a sample of plasma. The amber liquid caught the light, refracting it into a spectrum of gold and yellow. For a moment, Drew was lost in the beauty of the substance he had devoted his life to studying, a substance that had the power to save lives, yet had become a symbol of the racial divisions that plagued his nation. The microscope revealed the intricate structure of the plasma, but it could not show the human suffering caused by the segregation of this life-saving fluid. That was a reality Drew knew all too well. Since his resignation from the American Red Cross Blood Bank in 1941, Drew had thrown himself into his work at Howard University with renewed determination. He had been appointed chief of surgery and head of the Department of Surgery at Freedman's Hospital, positions that allowed him to influence the training of a new generation of black physicians. His days were filled with teaching, operating, and conducting research, his nights with writing papers and preparing lectures. Yet even as he immersed himself in the world of medicine, the issue of blood segregation continued to weigh heavily on his mind. The war was raging, and every day, news reports told of soldiers whose lives had been saved by blood plasma. Drew took pride in knowing that his research had made these miracles possible, but he was haunted by the knowledge that the system distributing this plasma was tainted by racism. The statistics were staggering. By 1943, the American Red Cross had collected more than 13 million pints of blood, processing it into plasma that was shipped to military hospitals and battlefronts around the world. This plasma had saved countless lives, reducing mortality rates from shock and hemorrhage by as much as 30% in some cases. Yet despite this success, the segregation of blood continued. Plasma from black donors was labeled colored and stored separately from plasma from white donors, which was labeled white. This policy had no scientific basis. Plasma is plasma, regardless of the race of the donor, but it reflected the pervasive racism of the time. For Drew, this was not just a scientific issue, but a moral one. He believed that medicine should transcend racial barriers, that the goal of saving lives should unite rather than divide. Yet the system he had helped create was doing the opposite. In the operating rooms at Freedman's Hospital, Drew continued to perform surgeries with skill and precision. His hands moved with the confidence that comes from years of experience, his mind focused on the task at hand. Yet even here, in the controlled environment of the hospital, the realities of segregation intruded. Freedman's Hospital served primarily black patients, and while the care provided was excellent, the very existence of a separate hospital for African Americans was a reminder of the segregated world in which they lived. Drew often wondered how many lives could be saved if the resources and expertise of hospitals like Freedman's were integrated into the broader medical system, if the racial barriers that divided American medicine were torn down. These thoughts stayed with him as he worked, a constant reminder of the challenges facing African Americans in the medical profession. The contrast between the progress being made in medical science and the persistence of racial prejudice was never more evident than in the field of blood transfusion. On one hand, Drew's research had revolutionized the way blood was collected, processed, and stored, making it possible to save lives on an unprecedented scale. On the other hand, the segregation of blood by race was a step backward, a rejection of scientific progress in favor of racial prejudice. This contradiction was particularly galling for Drew, who had devoted his life to advancing medical science. He had proven that blood was universal in its life-giving properties, yet society insisted on dividing it along racial lines. The amber plasma that should have been a symbol of unity was instead being used to reinforce division. Throughout 1943, Drew continued to speak out against the segregation of blood, though his efforts had little immediate effect. In lectures and public appearances, he argued passionately that the practice was not only scientifically baseless, but also morally indefensible. He pointed out that the same plasma that was being labeled colored or white was being used to save soldiers of all races on the battlefield, a fact that underscored the absurdity of the segregation policy. Yet despite the logic of his arguments, the U.S. military and the American Red Cross remained committed to their racist policies. For Drew, this was a painful reminder that scientific progress alone could not overcome the deeply ingrained prejudices of society. The impact of the blood segregation policy extended beyond the medical realm. It sent a powerful message to African Americans about their place in American society. Despite being asked to sacrifice for the war effort, to fight and die for their country, they were still considered second-class citizens, their contributions deemed inferior because of their race. This message was not lost on the African American community, which had been fighting for civil rights for decades. The segregation of blood became yet another rallying point in the struggle for racial equality, another example of the hypocrisy of a nation that claimed to stand for freedom and democracy while denying basic rights to some of its citizens. For Charles Drew, the personal impact of the blood segregation policy was profound. He had dedicated his life to medicine, to finding ways to save lives regardless of race or social status. Now, his work was being used to perpetuate the very racial divisions he had sought to overcome through science. The amber plasma that filled the glass containers in laboratories across the country, which should have been a symbol of unity and shared humanity, was instead being used to reinforce segregation and inequality. Drew was forced to confront a difficult truth. Scientific progress alone could not overcome the deeply ingrained prejudices of society. Even in the face of overwhelming scientific evidence, racism persisted, distorting and corrupting the life-saving potential of medical innovation. In the spring of 1943, Drew received a letter that would bring the issue of blood segregation into even sharper focus. The letter was from a young black soldier who had been wounded in combat and saved by a blood transfusion. The soldier expressed his gratitude for the medical care he had received, but he also asked a question that troubled Drew deeply. Why is it that my blood, which was good enough to fight for my country, is not good enough for a white person? The question struck at the heart of the contradiction Drew had been grappling with for years. How could a nation ask its citizens to sacrifice their lives for freedom and democracy abroad, while denying them basic rights and dignity at home? The letter stayed with Drew, a constant reminder of the human cost of racial prejudice. As the war continued, Drew became increasingly involved in the civil rights movement, using his stature as a renowned scientist to advocate for racial equality. He spoke at rallies and conferences, arguing that the fight against fascism abroad must be accompanied by a fight against racism at home. His words carried weight because of his scientific expertise and his personal experience with racial discrimination. Yet despite his growing prominence as a civil rights advocate, Drew never lost sight of his primary calling, medicine. He continued to teach and operate at Howard, to conduct research and publish papers, always striving to advance medical science while also challenging the racial barriers that limited its potential. The summer of 1943 brought with it a series of race riots in cities across the United States, including Detroit and New York. These outbreaks of violence were a stark reminder of the racial tensions that simmered beneath the surface of American society. For Drew, the riots were both tragic and predictable. They were the result of years of racial discrimination and economic inequality, of a society that asked African Americans to sacrifice for the war effort while denying them basic rights and opportunities. The riots underscored the urgency of the civil rights struggle, the need for fundamental change in American society. Yet even as the nation grappled with these issues, the segregation of blood continued, a symbol of the racial divisions that plagued American life. In the fall of 1943, Drew was invited to speak at a conference on blood transfusion and blood banking. The conference brought together leading experts from around the world, and Drew was asked to present his latest research on plasma preservation. It was an opportunity to share his scientific knowledge with colleagues, to contribute to the advancement of medical science. Yet as Drew prepared his presentation, he knew that he could not ignore the issue of blood segregation. In a field dedicated to saving lives, the practice of segregating blood by race was an affront to the very principles of medicine. Drew decided to use the conference as an opportunity to address this issue, to challenge his colleagues to confront the racial prejudices that were distorting their profession. The conference was held in a grand hotel in New York City, its halls filled with scientists and physicians from around the world. When Drew took the stage, a hush fell over the audience. He began his presentation with a discussion of his latest research, explaining the technical details of plasma preservation with clarity and precision. The audience listened with rapt attention, impressed by Drew's scientific expertise. But then Drew shifted gears, turning his attention to the issue of blood segregation. He spoke passionately about the scientific absurdity of segregating blood by race, about the moral implications of a practice that denied the universal nature of blood. He argued that medicine must transcend racial barriers, that the goal of saving lives should unite rather than divide. The audience was silent, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. After his presentation, Drew was approached by several colleagues who praised his courage in speaking out. Yet there were others who were less supportive, who argued that the issue of blood segregation was a political matter, not a scientific one. For Drew, this distinction was meaningless. Science and politics were intertwined, and the segregation of blood was both a scientific and a moral issue. He left the conference with mixed feelings, proud of having spoken his mind, but frustrated by the persistence of racial prejudice even in the scientific community. The amber plasma that should have been a symbol of unity was still being used to reinforce division, a contradiction that continued to haunt him. As 1943 drew to a close, Drew returned to Howard University, his commitment to medicine and to civil rights stronger than ever. He continued to teach and operate, to conduct research and speak out against racial injustice. The war raged on, and the blood plasma he had pioneered continued to save lives on battlefields around the world. Yet the system that distributed this life-saving fluid remained segregated, a stark reminder of the contradictions at the heart of American society. The man who had unlocked the secret of preserving plasma was still being forced to watch from the sidelines as his work was used to perpetuate racial divisions. It was a bitter irony that defined Drew's legacy, a legacy of scientific brilliance in the face of social injustice, of life-saving innovation in the midst of persistent racism. The amber plasma that flowed from his research had the power to unite humanity in its shared need for life, yet it was being used to divide, a contradiction that would haunt Charles Drew for the rest of his days. The unbreakable spirit. The early morning light filtered through the windows of Charles Drew's office at Howard University, casting long shadows across the floor. It was the spring of 1944, and the war in Europe was entering its final, brutal phase. Outside, the campus was coming to life, students hurrying to classes, the sounds of their voices carrying through the crisp air. Inside, Drew sat at his desk, surrounded by medical journals and research papers. In his hand, he held a small glass vial containing amber-colored plasma, turning it slowly to catch the light. The liquid shimmered, a testament to the scientific breakthroughs that had saved countless lives. Yet for Drew, this vial represented more than medical progress. It was a symbol of the ongoing struggle for racial equality, a reminder of the work that still needed to be done. By 1944, Charles Drew had become a prominent figure not only in the medical community, but also in the broader civil rights movement. His resignation from the American Red Cross Blood Bank had been widely publicized in the black press, and his subsequent criticism of the segregation policy had earned him both admirers and detractors. Yet Drew had never sought fame or recognition. His primary focus remained on his work at Howard University, on training the next generation of black physicians and advancing medical science. The vial of plasma in his hand was a constant reminder of this dual commitment to scientific excellence and to social justice. The war had brought unprecedented changes to American society, including new opportunities for African Americans. With millions of white men serving in the military, industries that had previously been closed to black workers were now hiring them out of necessity. This economic shift, combined with the growing civil rights movement, was beginning to challenge the racial status quo. Yet progress was slow, and discrimination remained pervasive. The segregation of blood by race was just one example of the many ways in which African Americans were still treated as second-class citizens, even as they were asked to sacrifice for the war effort. In the operating rooms at Freedman's Hospital, Drew continued to perform surgeries with skill and precision. His hands moved with the confidence that comes from years of experience, his mind focused on the task at hand. Yet even here, in the controlled environment of the hospital, the realities of segregation intruded. Freedman's Hospital served primarily black patients, and while the care provided was excellent, the very existence of a separate hospital for African Americans was a reminder of the segregated world in which they lived. Drew often wondered how many more lives could be saved if the resources and expertise of hospitals like Freedman's were integrated into the broader medical system, if the racial barriers that divided American medicine were torn down. The contrast between the progress being made in medical science and the persistence of racial prejudice was never more evident than in the field of blood transfusion. On one hand, Drew's research had revolutionized the way blood was collected, processed, and stored, making it possible to save lives on an unprecedented scale. On the other hand, the segregation of blood by race was a step backward, a rejection of scientific progress in favor of racial prejudice. This contradiction was particularly galling for Drew, who had devoted his life to advancing medical science. He had proven that blood was universal in its life-giving properties, yet society insisted on dividing it along racial lines. The amber plasma that should have been a symbol of unity was instead being used to reinforce division. Throughout 1944, Drew continued to speak out against the segregation of blood, though his efforts had little immediate effect. In lectures and public appearances, he argued passionately that the practice was not only scientifically baseless, but also morally indefensible. He pointed out that the same plasma that was being labeled colored or white was being used to save soldiers of all races on the battlefield, a fact that underscored the absurdity of the segregation policy. Yet despite the logic of his arguments, the U.S. military and the American Red Cross remained committed to their racist policies. For Drew, this was a painful reminder that scientific progress alone could not overcome the deeply ingrained prejudices of society. The personal cost of Drew's stance against segregation was significant. He had given up a position of prominence and influence when he resigned from the American Red Cross Blood Bank, and he had faced criticism from those who believed he should have compromised his principles for the sake of continuing his work. Yet Drew had no regrets. He believed that integrity was more important than position, that standing up for what was right was more important than personal advancement. This conviction had guided him throughout his life, and it continued to guide him now, even in the face of persistent racism and discrimination. In the summer of 1944, Drew received news that would bring the issue of blood segregation into even sharper focus. The Allied forces had launched the D-Day invasion of Normandy, and casualties were high. The demand for blood plasma was greater than ever, and the American Red Cross was working frantically to meet this demand. Yet despite the urgent need for plasma, the segregation policy remained in place. Plasma from black donors was still being labeled colored and stored separately from plasma from white donors, a practice that made no scientific sense and only served to reinforce racial divisions. For Drew, this was yet another example of the irrationality of racism, of the way in which prejudice could cloud judgment even in matters of life and death. As the war in Europe drew to a close, Drew began to think about the future, about what would happen once the fighting stopped. He hoped that the end of the war would bring an end to the segregation of blood, that the scientific evidence against the practice would finally prevail. Yet he knew that racial prejudice was deeply ingrained in American society, and that change would not come easily. The amber plasma that should have been a symbol of unity was still being used to reinforce division, a contradiction that continued to haunt him. In the fall of 1944, Drew was invited to speak at a conference on the future of medicine in post-war America. The conference brought together leading experts from around the country, and Drew was asked to share his vision for the future of blood banking and transfusion medicine. It was an opportunity to shape the direction of medical science in the post-war world, to ensure that the lessons learned during the war would not be forgotten. Yet as Drew prepared his presentation, he knew that he could not ignore the issue of blood segregation. He saw the conference as an opportunity to challenge his colleagues to confront the racial prejudices that were distorting their profession, to imagine a future in which medicine truly transcended racial barriers. The conference was held in a grand hotel in Chicago, its halls filled with scientists and physicians from around the country. When Drew took the stage, a hush fell over the audience. He began his presentation with a discussion of the advances in blood banking and transfusion medicine during the war, explaining how these innovations had saved countless lives. The audience listened with rapt attention, impressed by Drew's scientific expertise. Then Drew shifted gears, turning his attention to the issue of blood segregation. He spoke passionately about the scientific absurdity of segregating blood by race, about the moral implications of a practice that denied the universal nature of blood. He argued that the future of medicine depended on transcending racial barriers, on recognizing that the goal of saving lives should unite rather than divide. The audience was silent, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. After his presentation, Drew was approached by several colleagues who praised his courage in speaking out. Yet there were others who were less supportive, who argued that the issue of blood segregation was a political matter, not a scientific one. For Drew, this distinction was meaningless. Science and politics were intertwined, and the segregation of blood was both a scientific and a moral issue. He left the conference with mixed feelings, proud of having spoken his mind, but frustrated by the persistence of racial prejudice even in the scientific community. The amber plasma that should have been a symbol of unity was still being used to reinforce division, a contradiction that continued to haunt him. As 1944 drew to a close, Drew returned to Howard University, his commitment to medicine and to civil rights stronger than ever. He continued to teach and operate, to conduct research and speak out against racial injustice. The war in Europe was nearing its end, and the blood plasma he had pioneered continued to save lives on battlefields around the world. Yet the system that distributed this life-saving fluid remained segregated, a stark reminder of the contradictions at the heart of American society. The man who had unlocked the secret of preserving plasma was still being forced to watch from the sidelines as his work was used to perpetuate racial divisions. It was a bitter irony that defined Drew's legacy, a legacy of scientific brilliance in the face of social injustice, of life-saving innovation in the midst of persistent racism. The amber plasma that flowed from his research had the power to unite humanity in its shared need for life, yet it was being used to divide, a contradiction that would haunt Charles Drew for the rest of his days. The year 1945 began with a sense of anticipation, as the end of the war in Europe seemed imminent. In January, Drew received a letter from the American Red Cross, informing him that they were reconsidering their policy on blood segregation. The letter was cautiously worded, but it offered a glimmer of hope that change might finally be coming. For Drew, this was a moment of cautious optimism. He had been fighting against the segregation of blood for years, and while he knew that change would not come easily, he was encouraged by the possibility that his efforts might finally be bearing fruit. The amber plasma that should have been a symbol of unity might yet become one, a testament to the power of scientific truth over racial prejudice. In February 1945, Drew traveled to New York to meet with officials from the American Red Cross. The meeting was tense but productive, as Drew presented the scientific evidence against blood segregation and argued passionately for a change in policy. The Red Cross officials listened respectfully, acknowledging the validity of Drew's arguments, but also expressing concern about the potential backlash from those who supported segregation. Yet by the end of the meeting, there was a sense that progress was being made, that the Red Cross was seriously considering a change in policy. For Drew, this was a small but significant victory, a step in the right direction. In April 1945, the American Red Cross announced that it would be changing its policy on blood segregation, effective immediately. Henceforth, blood would no longer be labeled white or colored, and plasma from all donors would be processed and stored together. The announcement was a victory for Drew and for all those who had fought against the segregation of blood. Yet it was a bittersweet victory, coming as it did after years of unnecessary segregation and discrimination. For Drew, the policy change was a validation of his scientific expertise and his moral courage, a recognition that blood was indeed universal in its life-giving properties. The amber plasma that should have been a symbol of unity could now finally be one, a testament to the power of scientific truth over racial prejudice. The policy change by the American Red Cross was a significant milestone in the fight against racial segregation, but it was not the end of the struggle. Racial prejudice remained deeply ingrained in American society, and there were still many battles to be fought. Yet for Charles Drew, the policy change was a moment of triumph, a validation of the principles he had stood for throughout his career. He had proven that scientific progress and social justice were not mutually exclusive, that medicine could indeed transcend racial barriers. The amber plasma that had once been a symbol of division was now a symbol of unity, a testament to the power of perseverance and integrity in the face of adversity. As the war in Europe came to an end in May 1945, Drew reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. He had faced discrimination and prejudice, had been forced to choose between his principles and his position, had watched as his life-saving work was used to perpetuate racial divisions. Yet through it all, he had remained true to his convictions, had continued to fight for what he believed was right. The amber plasma that had once been a source of pain and frustration was now a source of pride, a symbol of the progress that could be achieved when science and justice worked hand in hand. For Charles Drew, this was the true measure of success, not just the lives saved by his medical innovations, but the barriers broken down by his unwavering commitment to equality and justice. The final journey. The amber glow of a laboratory lamp illuminated Charles Drew's face as he worked late into the night at Howard University. It was March 1950, nearly 5 years since the end of World War II. The world had changed, yet some things remained stubbornly the same. Drew, now 45 years old, had achieved international recognition for his pioneering work in blood preservation and transfusion medicine. He had trained hundreds of African American doctors, performed countless life-saving surgeries, and continued to push the boundaries of medical science. Yet even as he basked in the glow of professional accomplishment, the shadow of racial prejudice still loomed large over American society. The vial of plasma on his desk, catching the light with its golden hue, remained a powerful symbol of both his greatest achievement and his greatest struggle. The years since the war had been eventful for Drew. In 1946, he had been awarded the Spingarn Medal by the NAACP, the highest honor bestowed upon African Americans for outstanding achievement. The citation praised him not only for his scientific contributions, but also for his courage in standing up against racial discrimination in blood banking. It was a validation of the difficult path he had chosen, a recognition that his fight had been about more than just scientific truth. It had been about human dignity and equality. Yet even as he received this prestigious award, Drew remained humble, deflecting praise and emphasizing the collaborative nature of scientific progress. He saw himself not as a hero, but as a servant of medicine and humanity. In 1948, Drew had been elected Fellow of the International College of Surgeons, a rare honor that placed him among the most distinguished surgeons in the world. The same year, he had been appointed as a consultant to the Surgeon General of the U.S. Army, a position that allowed him to advise on medical policies and practices. These accolades were a testament to his expertise and dedication, yet they also highlighted the contradictions of his position. Here was a man who had been forced to resign from the American Red Cross Blood Bank because of his opposition to racial segregation, now serving as a consultant to the very military that had once enforced that segregation. For Drew, this was not a contradiction, but an opportunity to effect change from within, to ensure that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. The post-war years had also brought changes to Drew's personal life. His wife, Lenore, had been a constant source of support throughout his career, standing by him during the difficult times and celebrating his successes. Their 4 children, Charlene, Rhea, Charles Jr., and Bibe, were growing up fast, a constant reminder of the future he was fighting for. Drew was a devoted family man, finding joy in the simple pleasures of home life, even as he navigated the complexities of his professional and civil rights work. Yet the demands on his time were immense, and he often struggled to balance his many responsibilities. The vial of plasma on his desk was a constant reminder of the weight he carried, the expectations placed upon him as both a scientist and a symbol of racial progress. In the spring of 1950, Drew was invited to speak at the annual meeting of the John A. Andrew Memorial Hospital in Tuskegee, Alabama. It was an honor he accepted without hesitation, despite the challenges of traveling in the segregated South. Tuskegee was home to the Tuskegee Institute, a historically black university founded by Booker T. Washington, and the hospital was an important center for African American medical education and treatment. Drew saw the invitation as an opportunity to share his knowledge with the next generation of black doctors, and to support an institution that was doing vital work in a difficult environment. On the morning of April 1, 1950, Drew prepared for his journey to Tuskegee. He packed his bags, said goodbye to his family, and drove to the airport in Washington, D.C. The weather was clear, promising good flying conditions. Drew was an experienced traveler, having flown countless times for conferences and speaking engagements. Yet as he boarded the Eastern Airlines Flight 624, a DC-3 propeller plane bound for Greensboro, North Carolina, with a connection to Tuskegee, he could not have known that this would be his final journey. The flight proceeded normally for the first part of the journey. Drew reviewed his notes for the speech he was to deliver, his mind focused on the task ahead. He was looking forward to visiting Tuskegee, to seeing old friends and colleagues, to sharing his knowledge and experience with the students and faculty at the hospital. The amber plasma that had been the focus of his life's work was never far from his thoughts, and he planned to speak about the importance of blood banks and transfusion medicine in improving healthcare for African Americans. It was a topic that combined his scientific expertise with his commitment to racial equality, a perfect synthesis of the twin passions that had defined his career. As the plane approached its first stop in Greensboro, the weather began to deteriorate. A thick fog had rolled in, reducing visibility and making landing conditions difficult. The pilot circled the airport, waiting for a break in the fog, but the conditions did not improve. After several unsuccessful attempts to land, the pilot decided to divert to the alternate airport in Burlington, North Carolina. It was a decision that would prove fatal. At 8:05 a.m. on April 1, 1950, Eastern Airlines Flight 624 crashed into a field near Burlington, North Carolina. All 25 passengers and crew on board were killed instantly. The news of the tragedy spread quickly, sending shockwaves through the medical community and the nation at large. Charles Drew, the pioneering surgeon who had saved countless lives through his work on blood preservation, was dead at the age of 45. The irony of his death, surviving the battlefields of World War II only to perish in a routine domestic flight, was not lost on those who knew him. Nor was the tragic irony that the man who had developed techniques for storing and transporting blood to save lives had himself been beyond saving when the moment came. The news of Drew's death was met with an outpouring of grief and tributes from around the world. Colleagues praised his scientific genius and his contributions to medicine. Civil rights leaders hailed him as a hero who had stood up against racial discrimination. Ordinary people whose lives had been touched by his work mourned the loss of a great humanitarian. Yet even as the nation mourned, the circumstances of his death highlighted the persistent racial inequalities that had defined his life. In the immediate aftermath of the crash, a cruel rumor began to circulate, a rumor that Drew had died because he was denied a blood transfusion at a nearby white hospital. The story, though completely false, spoke volumes about the racial realities of the time. It was a reflection of the deep-seated fear among African Americans that they would be denied medical care because of their race, a fear that was not entirely unfounded given the history of segregation in American healthcare. The rumor also underscored the tragic irony of Drew's legacy. The man who had pioneered blood banking and transfusion medicine was now being associated with a death caused by the very racial barriers he had fought against. Drew's family and colleagues worked quickly to dispel the rumor, providing clear evidence that Drew had been killed instantly in the crash and that no medical intervention could have saved him. Yet the persistence of the rumor was a stark reminder of the racial divisions that still plagued American society. It was a testament to the power of the narrative Drew had embodied, the brilliant black scientist whose life-saving work was tainted by racial prejudice. The amber plasma that had been the focus of his life's work had now become entwined with the story of his death, a symbol of both his achievements and the ongoing struggle for racial equality. The funeral for Charles Drew was held on April 5, 1950, at the 19th Street Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. The church was filled to capacity with mourners from all walks of life: colleagues, students, civil rights leaders, and ordinary people whose lives had been touched by Drew's work. The eulogies painted a picture of a man who had been not only a brilliant scientist, but also a devoted husband and father, a respected teacher, and a courageous advocate for racial equality. The amber plasma that had been the focus of his life's work was mentioned repeatedly, not just as a scientific achievement, but as a symbol of his commitment to humanity and equality. In the weeks and months following Drew's death, tributes continued to pour in from around the world. The American Medical Association praised his contributions to transfusion medicine. The NAACP hailed him as a champion of civil rights. Colleagues and students shared stories of his kindness, his generosity, his unwavering commitment to excellence. Yet even as the nation mourned his loss, there was a sense that his work was not done, that the struggle for racial equality in medicine and society at large would continue without him. The amber plasma that had been the focus of his life's work remained a powerful symbol of both progress and the challenges that lay ahead. In the years following his death, Charles Drew's legacy continued to grow. Schools, hospitals, and medical centers were named in his honor. Scholarships were established in his name to support African American students pursuing careers in medicine. His pioneering work on blood preservation and transfusion medicine continued to save lives around the world, a testament to the enduring power of his scientific contributions. Yet the racial barriers he had fought against remained, a reminder that the struggle for equality was far from over. The Charles Drew University of Medicine and Science, founded in 1966 in Los Angeles, California, stands as perhaps the most enduring tribute to his legacy. The university, which focuses on training health professionals to serve underserved communities, embodies Drew's commitment to excellence in medicine and his dedication to improving healthcare for African Americans and other marginalized groups. The amber plasma that was the focus of his life's work continues to flow through the veins of patients around the world, a living testament to his scientific genius and his humanitarian spirit. Today, more than 70 years after his death, Charles Drew is remembered not only as a pioneering scientist, but also as a courageous advocate for racial equality. His life story is a powerful reminder of the contradictions at the heart of American society, a nation that has produced some of the world's greatest scientific advances while still grappling with the legacy of racial discrimination. The amber plasma that was the focus of his life's work remains a symbol of both the progress that has been made and the challenges that remain. It is a reminder that science alone cannot overcome prejudice, that true progress requires both scientific innovation and a commitment to social justice. Charles Drew once said, "The greatest tragedy in life is not death, but a life without purpose." By this measure, Drew's life was anything but tragic. He lived with purpose, dedicating himself to the advancement of medical science and the fight for racial equality. His work saved countless lives, his courage inspired generations, and his legacy continues to shape the world today. The amber plasma that was the focus of his life's work is a testament to his genius, his humanity, and his unwavering commitment to making the world a better place. In the end, Charles Drew's life was not defined by the tragedy of his death, but by the triumph of his spirit, a spirit that continues to inspire and guide us today. Section Conclusion Epilogue: The Amber Legacy. The amber plasma that once filled Charles Drew's laboratory vials continues to flow through the veins of patients around the world, a silent testament to a legacy that transcends both time and prejudice. In the decades since his untimely death, the world has transformed in ways Drew could scarcely have imagined. Blood banks operate without racial segregation, a fact we now take for granted, but which was once a battleground for scientific truth against racial ignorance. The techniques he pioneered have been refined and improved, yet the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Blood is a universal gift of life, blind to the color of skin or the boundaries nations draw between themselves. The story of Charles Drew forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about progress and prejudice. Scientific advancement does not automatically lead to social enlightenment. Knowledge alone cannot dismantle deeply ingrained systems of discrimination. Drew's life was a testament to this paradox, a brilliant scientist whose discoveries saved millions of lives, yet who was himself deemed unworthy by the very system he served. The amber plasma that symbolized his greatest achievement also represented his greatest struggle, the fight to have humanity recognize what science had already proven, that beneath our different exteriors, we share the same life-giving essence. Today, as we face new challenges that test our commitment to both scientific truth and human equality, Drew's legacy offers guidance. It reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to stand for principle, even when it comes at great personal cost. The amber plasma that once represented a medical breakthrough now symbolizes something more profound: the enduring power of human dignity in the face of injustice. Charles Drew's story is not merely a chapter in medical history. It is a mirror reflecting our ongoing struggle to build a society that lives up to its highest ideals, a society where science serves humanity and where the color of one's blood matters more than the color of one's skin.